wasn't loud. He wasn't dangerous. He was just sitting there. And yet, when she pointed at him like he didn't belong, the whole cabin turned to look. Not one person asked why. Not one person asked if he did. A man in a worn-out jacket, quiet, black, alone, surrounded by first-class silence and second-class stares. Before anyone knew his name, they judged his presence. Before he said a word, she tried to erase him. But what if the man they tried to humiliate owned the very seat they thought he stole? What if the man they tried to move was the reason the plane was in the air at all? This isn't just a story about a flight. This is about what happens when power meets prejudice and forgets that respect flies higher than status. You're about to witness a takedown without a single raised voice, a downfall written in silence, and a reminder. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one you tried to make invisible. Where are you watching from? What would you have done if you were there? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe stories like this matter, hit like and subscribe. More truth is coming. Let's begin. The first-class cabin buzzed with the quiet elegance expected on a transatlantic red-eye. Soft ambient lighting reflected off polished champagne flutes, and muted jazz hummed from the ceiling speakers. Claire Whitmore stepped into the aisle with the confidence of someone who had never known rejection. She wore a crisp white pantsuit that screamed wealth without trying too hard, and a Cartier timepiece that glinted like authority itself. Her heels clicked on the carpet with practiced dominance as she scanned the row for her seat. Her eyes stopped cold at 1B. No, not the seat, what was next to it. In 1A, a black man sat, hunched slightly, his posture guarded but dignified. He wore a faded brown blazer, the cuffs a little frayed, and corduroy pants that had seen better years. His suitcase, small, worn, utilitarian, sat under his feet instead of overhead. Claire's brows lifted. Her voice cut through the hum of conversation like a scalpel. "Excuse me, sir," she began loudly enough for the adjacent rows to hear. "I believe you're looking for the restroom. Coach is down that way." The man looked up, startled. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried history, stoic, quiet, unreadable. "I'm in the right place," he said evenly. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a paper boarding pass, creased, faded at the edges, but legible. "Seat 1A, first class." Claire didn't even glance at the paper. She turned to the flight attendant approaching from the galley. "Hi, yeah," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can you please verify this gentleman's seat? He seems to think 1A is his. But, I mean," her voice trailed off in faux politeness. The attendant took the ticket from the man, Jerome, and scanned it with a portable device on her belt. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "That's correct. Mr. Whitman is assigned to 1A. Claire's face twitched for a fraction of a second, but her smile quickly returned. "Wow," she said, still standing, her hand now resting on the headrest of 1B. "I guess the airline's upgrading all kinds of folks these days." She let the sentence hang there like stale perfume. Jerome didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply folded his ticket and slipped it back into his jacket. His hands were steady. That bothered her. The flight attendant gestured to Claire's seat. "Would you like some champagne while we finish boarding?" Claire sat down, not answering. She turned slightly to angle her body away from Jerome, as if his presence physically encroached on her space. Her elbow deliberately bumped his armrest. No apology. Jerome shifted subtly, giving her the room, but his eyes never left the aisle. Other passengers were now seated, casting sideways glances, picking up on the static. No one said a word. First-class etiquette. Hear nothing. Say less. Jerome reached down to pull a paperback from his bag, an old novel with a cracked spine. His hands, dark and calloused, flipped the pages with practiced ease. Claire, watching from the corner of her eye, huffed audibly. "I just assumed," she started, then caught herself. "Never mind." He didn't answer, didn't even blink. Her irritation flared like static electricity. "You know," she leaned closer, "this section's pretty expensive. You sure you didn't trade up at the gate?" The tone was sweet, curious, until you heard the venom beneath. I purchased my seat, he said simply. No explanation, no details. The bare truth, delivered without apology. That disarmed her more than any retort. The flight attendant returned with champagne. Anything for you, Mr. Whitman. Water, he said. Claire snorted softly and sipped her drink. Interesting choice, she muttered. The boarding doors closed with a thump. The hum of engines began to rise. Claire adjusted her seat, but couldn't shake the discomfort coiled beneath her skin. He didn't belong here, not by her definition. She didn't need to say it out loud. Her body said it for her, leaning away, stiffening when he adjusted his tray table, sighing when he coughed. But he didn't react, didn't ask for acknowledgement, didn't meet her contempt with fire. That was its own kind of power. As the plane lifted into the clouds, Claire glanced sideways again. He was reading, unbothered, like he'd done this before, like he wasn't here for her validation. That made her furious, because the thing Claire hated more than being wrong was being invisible. And to him, she was. The way he ignored her, that calm, composed stillness, scraped at her nerves like sandpaper. She couldn't explain why it got under her skin so much. Maybe it was because she was used to owning every room she walked into, used to people recognizing her, adjusting their tone when they heard her last name or saw the logo on her laptop. Yet here he was, dressed like a substitute janitor from the 70s, showing her nothing but the soft steel of indifference. She couldn't stand it. So, she said suddenly, her voice too loud for the hush of the cabin, what brings you to first class? Win a sweepstakes or something? Jerome didn't look up. His thumb slid to the next page of the novel. Claire leaned a little closer. No offense, of course. It's just not every day you see. Well, such eclectic travelers in this section. The words hung like bait in the air. No bite, not even a blink. Claire smiled with mock sweetness and turned toward the flight attendant passing by. Excuse me, she said, waving two fingers delicately. Is there any way we can freshen the air up here? I think there might be something off in this part of the cabin. She wrinkled her nose as if enduring some invisible nuisance. The attendant's eyes darted toward Jerome, then back to Claire, unsure. I can bring a light freshener, ma'am, but we generally avoid aerosols in enclosed spaces unless it's an emergency. Claire widened her eyes, feigning concern. Oh, but I think this qualifies. I mean, it's not unbearable, just noticeable. Right? She turned to the couple across the aisle, who immediately averted their eyes. I'm sure others are thinking the same. The attendant, caught in the awkward gravity of Claire's corporate charm, gave a quick nod and disappeared. Jerome, through it all, didn't so much as sigh. His hands rested gently on the open pages. His breathing stayed even, but his shoulders had shifted, just barely, a subtle tension in his back now, as if the weight of humiliation was finally pressing inward. Claire picked up her champagne again, sipped slowly, and exhaled with exaggerated satisfaction. Much better, she said, though nothing had changed yet. You know, she continued, I once donated to a startup program that gives underprivileged folks mentorship and exposure. Great cause. You remind me of one of the success stories. She said it without looking at him, like it was a compliment, like she was lifting him. Are you in tech? She added. Or maybe delivery logistics? Her tone was sweet poison. Jerome finally turned a page, then spoke quietly, without looking up. Not quite. Claire tilted her head, intrigued by the simplicity of his reply. Not quite, she repeated, chuckling. That's vague. You don't strike me as a finance guy, unless it's crypto. No response. Just the whisper of another page turned. The flight attendant returned discreetly with a small handheld diffuser and placed it on the console between their seats. A citrus scent soon blended into the cabin air, subtle, manufactured cleanliness. Claire inhaled and sighed. There we go, she said with satisfaction. She then reached into her designer bag, pulled out a silk scarf, and tied it loosely around her neck like armor. Air quality's so inconsistent these days, she added, just loud enough. Occasionally, her gaze flicked toward Jerome, whose book remained open but unread now. His posture hadn't changed much, but something in the line of his jaw had tightened, like a rope drawn taut. The air between them had grown colder than the cabin temperature. Claire took another long sip, then set her glass down, tilting her head toward Jerome with mock curiosity. "You're not cold?" she asked, voice laced with exaggerated concern. "You've barely moved since takeoff. You must be freezing in that little blazer." Jerome didn't respond. His hands rested lightly on the book, but his eyes were fixed forward, unfocused, distant. Claire reached for the neatly folded blanket at her feet, the one she had requested but hadn't used. She lifted it with one hand and, in a single fluid motion, tossed it across Jerome's lap and over his chest. The thin Airline blanket slid up over his shoulder and across his neck, the top edge covering part of his chin and cheek. "There you go," Claire said, as if she had done a favor. "You looked like you needed it more than I did." Her voice was syrupy, but her eyes glinted with provocation. Jerome calmly reached up and peeled the blanket off his face, folding it slowly, precisely, and setting it on the middle armrest, neutral ground. He said nothing. That silence struck her harder than any insult. Claire leaned back, lips pursed in amusement. "Well," she muttered, "some people really don't know how to take kindness." The attendant walked by again, checking overhead bins, and Claire flagged her with a single raised finger. "Excuse me, could I get another napkin?" The attendant returned seconds later with a small, crisp napkin folded in half. Claire took it without thanks, then bent slightly to examine her shoe. "Oh, would you look at that?" she murmured, more to herself than anyone. "Scuffed already." She extended her foot slightly, turning it so that the tip of the pointed heel faced Jerome. "Since you're already sitting so close to the aisle, maybe you could help me with this." Without waiting for a reply, she dropped the napkin onto his lap. "It's just a quick wipe. Here, I'll hold my foot steady." Her tone was light, playful, like someone giving a child a chore, but the sharpness underneath was unmistakable. The napkin landed squarely on Jerome's folded hands. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, he picked it up and placed it neatly on the tray table, untouched. Claire's smile tightened. "You're really not a team player, huh?" she said. "Most people would have just done it. It's not like I asked you to polish them." She adjusted her posture again, brushing imaginary lint from her sleeve. "You know, it's funny," she added, glancing sideways. "You sit here all stiff and proper, like you're trying to prove something. But nobody's watching, you know. Nobody really cares." The couple across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. A man one row behind them cleared his throat, but said nothing. The silence was an accomplice. Jerome turned a page, though it was clear he hadn't read a word. Claire leaned back into her seat, arms crossed loosely. "I bet you're one of those types who think staying quiet makes you dignified," she said. "But sometimes silence is just cowardice dressed up pretty." Still, Jerome didn't reply. His grip on the book tightened just slightly, the skin along his knuckles stretching taut, but his eyes remained unreadable. Claire stared at him for a long moment, then finally gave a breathy laugh and turned her head toward the window. The dinner service began like any other first-class experience, with white linen napkins being unfolded onto laps and silverware clinking softly as meal trays were distributed row by row. The scent of grilled salmon and herb butter floated into the air, accompanied by the soft shuffle of attendants gliding between seats with polished ease. Claire busied herself with a menu she barely read, making a point to comment on the wine list to the flight attendant, as if hosting a dinner party. "I'll take the Chardonnay." "No, wait, do you have that reserve Riesling from Napa?" "The 2019, she asked, smiling with effortless entitlement. The attendant nodded and quickly retrieved her request, pouring it with practiced grace. Claire held up her glass and gave an approving nod. "Perfect." The tray in front of her was soon adorned with a meticulously arranged plate of grilled asparagus, seared scallops, and saffron risotto, all still steaming under the warming dome. She glanced sideways at Jerome's tray table, still empty. No menu, no drink, nothing. She said nothing at first, but her smirk was audible in the silence. Jerome sat upright, hands resting quietly on the closed book now laying across his lap. His eyes remained forward, unfocused, but alert. A young attendant approached their row, placing dishes and drinks with care, but skipped Jerome entirely. When he finally raised his eyes and asked softly, "Excuse me, will there be a meal service for me?" the attendant blinked, as if surprised he was still seated there. "Oh," she said, looking briefly at her tablet. "Let me check. I don't see a selection for you, sir. Most first-class passengers pre-select their meals." Her tone was polite, but the underlying current carried an unspoken judgment. "You don't know how this works, do you?" Jerome's voice remained composed. "I wasn't aware it was required." The attendant nodded quickly. "I'm sorry. We do have a light vegetarian option available, if that works for you." Claire's fork paused midair. "Poor guy," she said aloud, voice dripping with fake sympathy. "First class is so complicated these days. All the menus and etiquette and timing. I remember my first time flying up here. Everything's so confusing when you're not used to it, right?" She didn't even look at him when she said it. The attendant glanced between them and murmured something about checking availability before quickly disappearing toward the galley. Jerome nodded once and returned his gaze to the window. Claire lifted her glass again, swirled the wine, and sniffed it theatrically. "You know, I actually envy your restraint," she said. "No food, no drink, just peace and quiet. It's almost monk-like." She popped a piece of scallop into her mouth and chewed slowly, dramatically, savoring every bite. A few moments later, she reached for the small bowl of lemon-scented water provided for hand cleansing, dipped the edge of her linen towel into it, and dabbed her fingers delicately. Then, with a sudden flick, she wrung the damp cloth just enough to send a few droplets flying, and one small splash landed squarely on Jerome's forearm. "Oops," she said, without a trace of apology. "You startled me. I thought you moved for a second." Jerome looked down at the wet mark blooming on his jacket sleeve. It wasn't much, just a few droplets, but it was enough. Enough to be humiliating. Enough to be loud in its intention. Claire leaned closer, as if whispering something private, but made sure it was loud enough for those seated around them to hear. "You might want to wash up. That jacket looks like it's absorbed a lot of history." She laughed softly to herself and resumed her meal. Jerome slowly reached for a tissue from his breast pocket and dabbed at the sleeve. Not hurried, not angry, just precise. His face revealed nothing, but inside something buckled. Claire, now onto her dessert, chuckled lightly at something on her phone before turning to the woman across the aisle, an older lady in pearls and a silk shawl who had been careful not to look at anyone for too long. "We do a lot of community outreach at my firm," Claire said, her voice smooth and performative, just loud enough to carry across rows. "Especially for displaced individuals. You know, people struggling to find stability. We partner with local shelters, workforce re-entry programs, that kind of thing." The woman smiled awkwardly. Claire glanced sideways at Jerome, then added, "We even launched a new initiative last quarter. Business attire donations. You'd be amazed what a clean blazer can do for someone's self-worth." Her eyes stayed fixed on her spoon, but the jab had been launched, sharp and deliberate. The woman in pearls gave a tight nod, clearly uncomfortable, and turned back to her travel magazine. Claire didn't stop. "I mean, it's not charity. It's about dignity. Helping people understand they don't have to stay stuck in the place life left them. If they really want it, they can find a way out." She finally looked toward Jerome now, expression innocent, voice softer. "You'd be amazed at the transformations we've seen." Jerome kept his hands clasped together, resting them gently on the closed book on his lap. His face showed no expression, but his knuckles had begun to whiten again. The silence between them thickened. Claire picked up her glass of wine and swirled it lightly. At that moment, another flight attendant, this one newer, younger, passed by, holding a tray with 2 drinks. She leaned toward their row. "Cabernet for 1B?" she asked, glancing at Claire, then back at the tray. Claire was distracted and didn't respond right away, so the attendant mistakenly placed the glass on Jerome's tray table instead. "Here you go, sir," she said. Jerome blinked, surprised, and opened his mouth slightly, but before he could speak, Claire turned, expression frozen. "Oh no," she said, raising a hand. "That's for me." The attendant looked startled. I'm sorry, ma'am, I thought." Claire waved off the apology with a tight-lipped smile. "It's fine. Just bring me a fresh one." please." She then turned back toward the cabin, but not before adding under her breath, still loud enough for others to hear, "I don't share glassware with strangers, especially not ones I didn't invite." The wine stayed untouched on Jerome's tray. The young attendant hesitated, uncertain, but Claire had already shifted back into her seat, her focus now fully on her tablet screen again. Jerome stared at the glass for a long moment, then slowly slid it to the far edge of his tray and lowered the cover with care, as if sealing away something toxic. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it felt final, like a lock clicking into place. Around them, no one said a word. Not the businessman across the aisle, not the couple 3 rows back who had been following the quiet drama with uncomfortable interest. Even the attendants seemed to float past now with deliberate neutrality, as if their silence somehow absolved them from complicity. Claire finished her second dessert, dabbed at her lips, and adjusted her seat without so much as a glance in Jerome's direction. But her smirk lingered, faint and cruel. To her, this wasn't just about discomfort. It was about erasure, about putting someone in their place and keeping them there. And as long as he stayed silent, she believed she was winning. Jerome turned slightly toward the window again. Claire reclined slightly in her seat and pressed the service button, waiting with her usual poise, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. A senior attendant, older than the others and clearly experienced, arrived with quiet efficiency. "Yes, ma'am," she asked, her tone courteous but alert. Claire leaned toward her, lowering her voice just enough to suggest something serious, but making sure it was still audible to the rows nearby. "I don't mean to cause trouble," she began, her expression carefully molded into concerned restraint, "but the man next to me, he's been behaving oddly. I don't feel safe." The attendant's eyes flicked to Jerome, who remained perfectly still. "He hasn't said anything inappropriate," Claire continued, "but he's, very intense. Staring, breathing heavily. I don't know, it's probably nothing. But with all the incidents lately, I figured I should say something before it becomes one." The attendant stiffened ever so slightly, nodding with polite concern. "Of course, ma'am. We'll monitor the situation." She walked away, but moments later, a uniformed male flight crew member took position a few rows back, hovering as if on standby. Another attendant walked slowly past Jerome's seat more frequently, pretending to check on other passengers, but glancing at him each time with a flicker of unease. Jerome didn't move. He had heard every word. He knew the script, the looks, the unspoken shift, the way one false accusation, barely whispered, never proven, could turn perception into judgment, judgment into fear, and fear into isolation. His fingers pressed more tightly against the book. His breathing remained controlled, but his chest ached, and not from altitude. Claire adjusted her pillow with a satisfied little movement, leaning into the seat like someone who had just been vindicated. She didn't look at him again, but her words still hung in the air, poisonous and unchecked. Then, after a long pause, she pressed the call button again. This time, when the attendant returned, Claire was already shaking her head. "I know this sounds extreme," she said, lowering her voice into a confidential murmur, "but honestly, I think it would be best for everyone if he were reseated. I mean, people paid a premium for this cabin. It's supposed to be a relaxing space. And I know I'm not the only one who feels on edge. I've seen others looking over too." The attendant glanced toward the back of the plane, visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," she began cautiously, "he hasn't done anything in violation of protocol." "I understand," Claire said smoothly. "I'm just saying, sometimes it's not about what someone does. It's about what they project. Her voice was light, but the pressure was real. And the attendant, caught between optics and policy, didn't respond. She walked away again, but Jerome saw the whisper exchanged with the other crew, saw the subtle nod, saw the shift. And then he saw the gaze of the businessman across the aisle, different now, not curious, but wary, as if Jerome might suddenly rise, shout, lash out. Even as he sat perfectly still, he wasn't just unwelcome now. He was perceived as a threat, a liability, an unpredictable variable in a cabin of controlled experiences. His presence no longer simply didn't belong, It was now something to be managed, dismissed, removed. He looked down at his hands. Still steady, still composed, but he felt them going numb. The page of the book in his lap hadn't turned in over 30 minutes. He wasn't reading anymore. He wasn't even pretending. Across from him, Claire scrolled lazily on her tablet. One leg crossed over the other, a satisfied half-smile still lingering on her face, as if she'd just conquered something beneath her. She thought she had won. The attendants had stopped asking Jerome anything at all. He was no longer offered water, no longer asked if he needed a blanket or a refill. In the eyes of the crew and of most passengers, he had become background noise, a presence to be observed, not addressed. But then, a sound disrupted the rhythm of the cabin, a voice, firm and authoritative, murmuring something at the galley door. It belonged to a woman middle-aged, dressed in a slightly more formal version of the flight attendant uniform. She walked with quiet confidence, her expression unreadable. She leaned down and whispered something to one of the crew members stationed near Claire's row. The young attendant's eyes widened slightly. She nodded once and turned to move toward the cockpit. Seconds passed. Then the curtain to the flight deck parted, and the pilot himself emerged, a tall man with silver at his temples and an expression carved from calm authority. The passengers near the front turned, surprised to see the captain in the aisle mid-flight. He walked straight toward 1A, his gaze steady, posture upright. The hush that had lingered over the cabin now became charged, electric, expectant. The pilot's voice rang out, clear and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "pardon the interruption, but I'm looking for a Mr. Jerome Whitman." Claire froze mid-scroll. Her fingers stopped moving. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. Jerome looked up slowly. His face remained composed, though a flicker of something, recognition, maybe disappointment, passed through his eyes. "That would be me," he answered quietly. The pilot nodded, then turned his head to address the cabin at large. "It is a distinct honor to welcome Mr. Jerome Whitman aboard today," he announced. Mr. Whitman is the chairman of Whitman Capital and a founding investor in our parent company, Global Aero Holdings. Without his vision, this airline would not exist in its current form. The words rippled through the rows like thunder through still water. Heads turned, eyes widened. People who had looked past Jerome for hours now stared at him as if seeing a ghost. Claire's breath caught audibly. The pilot continued. "On behalf of the crew and company leadership, we'd like to thank Mr. Whitman for joining us today. If there's anything you need, sir, please let us know personally." He nodded once more to Jerome, then turned and calmly walked back to the cockpit, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Claire sat frozen, color draining from her face. Her hand still hovered near her glass, but it trembled slightly now. Jerome didn't look at her. He simply exhaled through his nose, long and slow, and straightened his posture in the seat he had never surrendered. A few seats behind, someone whispered, "Did he say chairman?" Another passenger leaned toward his wife and muttered, "That's the Whitman? The investment guy." The air shifted. The same passengers who had avoided eye contact now leaned forward in subtle awe. The same crew members who had dismissed him now exchanged glances filled with unease. And Claire? She stared straight ahead, lips slightly parted, blinking rapidly as if trying to reverse time with sheer will. For the first time in hours, no one saw Jerome as the poor, silent man in seat 1A. Claire sat frozen for a moment longer after the captain returned to the cockpit, her tablet screen dimming as her fingers hovered lifelessly above it. She blinked twice, lips parted slightly as if some excuse or deflection might form in her mouth, but no words came. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the hot pressure of eyes she had once comfortably ignored. Across the aisle, the woman in pearls suddenly found her courage and offered Jerome a polite, deferential smile. Jerome did not return it. He simply leaned back against his seat, folded his hands neatly in his lap, and allowed the silence to speak for him. Claire finally straightened in her seat, cleared her throat, and reached again for her tablet, this time unlocking it with forced calmness. Her posture now was tighter, more rigid, the elegance stripped down to pure formality. She opened her email and refreshed it once. Then again. The subject line of the top message changed before her eyes. Urgent, fund freeze, Whitman Capital. Her face paled as she tapped to open it. The message was brief, clinical, merciless. Effective immediately. All planned bridge investments and equity infusions via Whitman Capital are suspended across your portfolio entities, pending internal review. Board-level response required. Do not speak to press. Her throat tightened. The next message came within seconds. It was from her assistant, Claire, media sniffing. Whitman ID confirmed on manifest. Legal team recommends statement within the hour. Board wants a call the moment we land. You're trending. She quickly locked the screen, gripping the device in both hands like a lifeline. But her breathing had already begun to shift. Her chest moved faster now, the calm unraveling behind her eyes. Jerome hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. But she could feel his presence now more than ever, not as a burden beside her, but as a weight pressing down on everything she had tried to project. She turned toward him slowly, not sure why, maybe out of some strange hope that a smile, an apology, a joke, anything might soften what was already happening. Well, she said, voice brittle, guess I owe you a drink, huh? Her laugh came out weak, hollow. Jerome finally looked at her, his gaze lifting with deliberate pace. His eyes were calm, but no longer unreadable. There was no fire in them, no cruelty, no gloating. Just something sharper, truth without emotion, clarity without warmth. No, he said. You owe yourself the truth. Claire blinked, stunned. Jerome turned his eyes away, not in dismissal, but in liberation. For the first time since boarding, he breathed without burden. The artificial air in the cabin suddenly felt tolerable again. He picked up his book, not to read, but to hold. It was no longer a shield. It was just paper now. Claire's phone vibrated violently in her lap. Another message. Another alert. Her eyes darted to it, but didn't open it. Instead, she sat back in her seat, defeated in posture, but still pretending at composure, trying to hold together the pieces of a public image she thought was unshakable. Around her, the flight attendants moved with restored neutrality, offering Jerome a drink now, finally. He accepted water, gave a slight nod, and nothing more. The offer was not an apology, it was a correction. Claire reached again for her wine, but her hand paused midway. She set it down. She had tasted victory so long, she had forgotten what humility tasted like. And now, it sat on her tongue like iron. The man she had tried to reduce, erase, mock into silence, had never needed to raise his voice. He had never even needed to announce himself. His dignity had been there all along. It was her blindness that made it invisible. Jerome looked toward the window, the clouds rolling beneath the wings like tides shifting in his favor. Claire shifted again in her seat, and this time it was she who felt small. He turned back once more, his voice low, steady, absolute. You taught me something today, Claire, he said without malice. You reminded me what quiet hatred looks like in a polished world. And for that, thank you. She looked away. Her phone, however, kept buzzing. Another vibration, another message. She didn't need to read it. She already knew. The last one she opened had been from her CFO. It had begun with Claire, this is serious, and ended with the board will handle this immediately. Outside the window, the skyline of New York emerged like a verdict, tall, sharp, unapologetic. The runway loomed beneath them. The moment of impact was no longer metaphoric. When the plane touched down, the tires shrieked softly against the tarmac, and the weight of everything Claire had built for herself suddenly felt too heavy to carry in a single breath. She inhaled deeply, fighting to hold it together. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate, and the final chime announced arrival. The pilot's voice returned, calm and professional, but Claire barely heard it. She was staring straight ahead, jaw clenched, sweat forming at her hairline. As soon as the aircraft reached the bridge, the front door opened, and waiting just beyond the threshold was a man in a charcoal suit holding a badge. He stepped in with authority, nodded at the lead attendant, then spoke quietly into a radio. Another crew member approached Claire's row, leaned down, and said in a tone so neutral it sounded robotic, "Ms. Whitmore, please remain seated. You'll be the last to disembark." The words weren't a request. Claire's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She only nodded, a single mechanical movement. Around her, the other passengers began standing, gathering their bags, glancing her way, and then quickly away. No one spoke to her. No one offered a look of sympathy or defense. They moved past her like she was luggage left behind. Jerome rose slowly from his seat, his movements unhurried, deliberate. His book was still tucked beneath his arm. His coat, slightly wrinkled, hung over one shoulder. As he stepped into the aisle, Claire looked up at him for the first time since the captain's announcement. There was no longer any defiance in her eyes, only exhaustion and fear. Jerome paused. He looked at her, not with scorn or vengeance, but with a clarity that made her shrink in her seat. His voice was quiet, steady, and unmistakably final. "Today," he said, "you sat above me. Tomorrow I'm still there. You're not." The words hit harder than any outburst ever could. He walked away without looking back. As he stepped off the plane, he was met with a firm handshake from the same suited man, followed by a respectful escort into the terminal. Behind him, the final announcement played. "We'd like to thank you for flying with us today." Claire sat alone now in the empty cabin, the seatbelt still fastened, the silence heavier than before. Within the hour, a press release was issued by her company. It read, "We are aware of the events involving CEO Claire Whitmore. Effective immediately, she is suspended from all executive duties pending full investigation. Our organization maintains a zero-tolerance policy on discrimination, regardless of position or tenure." It was clinical, swift, unforgiving, and in less than 12 hours, every major business outlet would carry the story. Photos from the flight would circulate. Anonymous quotes would appear. Analysts would dissect not just the collapse of Claire Whitmore's career, but the moment it cracked, midair, seat 1B. By the next morning, the storm was no longer circling. It had made landfall. Screens from coast to coast glowed with headlines, breaking alerts, and churns flashing her name in all caps. Claire Whitmore accused of onboard harassment. CEO under fire for alleged racial discrimination. The footage, grainy but damning, came from a security feed not meant for public release, leaked from somewhere deep within airline operations. It showed everything. Her tossing the blanket with condescension, flinging the napkin, waving the wine away with that unmistakable smirk. Her words weren't captured clearly, but her tone didn't need subtitles. It was enough. The internet didn't hesitate. Within hours, the clip spread across every major platform. Influencers stitched it, activists dissected it, legal analysts debated it. But what cut deepest wasn't the legal commentary. It was the simple fact that nobody watching needed to be told who was wrong. They knew, and the silence of the man in seat 1A became louder than any outburst ever could. He didn't yell. He didn't protest. He didn't demand. He endured. And in doing so, he exposed the ugliness hiding in plain sight. By noon, #Jerome Whitman trended worldwide. Posts called him a symbol of composed defiance, of silent justice, of power that didn't need to be flashy to be absolute. Memes emerged, but none mocking him. Instead, they quoted him, painted him with dignity, gave him titles like the quiet executive, the chairman in corduroy, and the man who let the world watch her fall. Meanwhile, Claire's world continued its freefall. By mid-afternoon, 2 board members publicly resigned in protest of the company's delayed response. Major investors issued joint statements condemning her conduct. The company's stock plummeted. Publicists scrambled. Lawyers postured. Her legal team issued a statement attempting damage control, citing miscommunication and a misunderstanding elevated by media spin. But the world had already decided. The tape was too real, the silence too loud, the impact too honest. And Jerome? He remained unreachable. He made no official comment. He didn't appear in front of cameras. He didn't tweet. He didn't need to. When a journalist finally caught up to him outside his Midtown office building 3 days later, surrounded by staff and shielded by respect rather than security, He paused briefly. Microphones surged forward. Questions were shouted. Most went unanswered. But one reporter, quieter than the rest, simply asked, "Mr. Whitman, do you have anything you want to say to the public about what happened?" Jerome stopped walking. He turned toward the reporter, face calm, voice steady, and answered with only one sentence. "Truth is quiet while it suffers," he said. "But when it speaks, everyone listens." Then he turned back and walked inside. The clip went viral instantly. Again. That night, networks replayed it, pundits praised it, and people from every background shared it, reflecting on the story of the man who never needed to shout to be heard. And in homes and offices and classrooms across the country, people watched a woman fall, not because she was caught, but because she never thought anyone would look. And they watched a man rise, not because he demanded justice, but because he carried it with him the entire time. Claire's resignation became official within the week. Her statement was short, lawyer-drafted, and emotionally void. No one really cared. The legacy she had tried to build through power games and cold efficiency collapsed, not in a scandal of money or corruption, but in the way she treated another human being when she thought no one would remember his name. But the world did. They remembered Jerome Whitman, not because of his wealth or status, but because he reminded them that power isn't how loud you speak, but how firmly you stand when the world tries to push you out of your seat. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. We tell the stories others try to silence. Where are you watching from today? And what moment hit you the hardest in this story? Was it the silence in Seat 1A or the sentence that ended it all? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one.